Hello and a very warm welcome to our evening lecture with Professor Geltner. And I also welcome the people on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us, and we are happy to have this hybrid solution today. And yes, today, before I will introduce Guy Geltner, who is giving the talk entitled Eat, Pray, Dig, Preventative Healthcare Among Minors in Europe, 1200 to 1600. Let me please introduce Thomas Stöllner to giving a few introductory remarks on the resource campus reform, resources and transformation that is the context for our today's talk. Thomas.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to remove my mask. I welcome, of course, Professor Geltner, and also thank you to Professor Tina Asmussen to make the moderation, to have been inviting you. I'm very glad you're not fenced in Australia, but you are with us today. So what is reform? Reform, as Tina explained, resources and transformation, is a so-called Leibniz Research Campus. So we are very glad to have got such a nice tool to deepen our scientific interest and cooperation into this interdisciplinary debates, also research on resources, which is a very, very wide frame, of course. And what we are planning with the research with this Leibniz campus is to bring the extra universal research of the Deutsches Bergbaumuseum to the field of universities, especially the Ruhr University, to benefit from the whole and the broadness of universital research in combination with a very specialized research group here at the Mining Museum, for instance, on mining archaeology, archaeometallurgy, mining history, and so on and so forth. And therefore, after the coronavirus have somehow slowed us down for a while, we are now able to have also, let's say, a first keynote. I'm very glad we have you here. During our kickoff meeting of Reform, on yesterday we had a lot of debates, how we define resources, how to do with resources on a special Bochum perspective. And now we will hear a keynote that possibly also draws us into that. And therefore I return to Tina, who will also introduce now our speaker. And I'm very glad to hear now.
Yes,
So you have to take this.
Yeah. So I have the enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Geltner, who came to us from Australia via Amsterdam. And Guy Geltner is a social and cultural historian of mining, public health, punishment, and urban culture from the University of Amsterdam and the Monash University in Melbourne. He has published numerous monographs, edited volumes, and articles on corporal punishment, medieval prisons, anti-corruption, deviance among and violence against medieval mendicant orders. And in 2019, he published a monograph entitled Roads to Health, Infrastructure and Public Well-Being in Later Medieval Italy at University of Pennsylvania Press. It received the book prize for medieval studies from the American Association of Italian Studies. Congratulations. Among his recent research interests is the history of mining in pre-industrial cultures from social, cultural, and environmental history, and that's why we are so thrilled to have you here. And the paper he's presenting us today is emerged from his amazing team project entitled Pre-Modern Healthscaping, which is funded by the European Research Council with the prestigious Consolidators Grant. It traces preventative health theories, policies, and practices among several types of populations and today we are talking you about the mining culture in Europe. And we are delighted to having you here, and we are looking forward to your paper. And Guy, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming physically here despite the risks, and for joining us wherever you are online today. And comments continue to be welcome, both at the time that we have to discuss or later. I'm available via email, etc. Please feel free to reach out and share your thoughts. Although mining is almost synonymous with industrial modernity, its history, I tell no one, nothing new in this company. Its history runs far deeper. For millennia, mines around the world functioned as ground zero for numerous goods, scientific innovation, and great fortunes. They also involved environmental degradation, forced migration, risky labor practices, and the disruption of local communities. On many of these counts, a pivotal yet still obscure chapter in mining history began to unfold in Europe in the late 12th century. It was here that mines emerged as complex sites employing mostly free workers to support trans-regional economies in an increasingly integrated commodities market. By the close of the 16th century, hundreds of self-organized mining communities excavated what I call Europe's underground cathedrals before colonialism, explosives, and steam engines transformed the sector's structure and its global footprint. Between these two watersheds, miners' social, cultural, and environmental history remains largely unstudied, and this is the subject of my current book project. Today, I'd like to focus on one strand within this project, namely the health of miners. I first became interested in mining communities from a preventative health perspective as groups facing particular environmental risks. While attempting to trace how miners conceptualized and managed risk, I became drawn to their remote sites, legal privileges, religious practices, and unique lore, as well as the variety of archaeological research illuminating them all over Europe, and indeed around the world. But as I said, today we will focus on miners' health, safety, and well-being, and in a way that illuminates both emic or cultural insider perspective and etic or present-day evaluations of the sector's medical past. I'll begin almost arbitrarily in France, but as you will see, this is truly a regional phenomenon. So on 30th May, 1413, Charles VI already issued an edict concerning the miners of his realm. The text reiterates the crown's direct ownership of all mines where ores could be extracted and for which the treasury was to receive 10% of the value of processed metals. In return, the king and his representatives, both secular and ecclesiastic, were to dedicate sufficient resources. We have it. Sufficient resources to maintain and protect those who assay and live in these sites, making their residences there, they themselves or those appointed by them, and who know the manner and science of excavating mines, and provide them with such privileges, licenses, and liberties that would allow them to live freely and securely in our kingdom. Likewise, because many of them hail from foreign countries, nations and countries, and since many die and suffer injury while carrying out this work, both due to the foul odors of the said mines and the other dangers that mining involves, we, as our royal predecessors have done in similar cases, must preserve and protect them from any violence, oppression, harm, and molestation. Any honest social account of mining's push and pull factors, like this one, had to acknowledge the risks that laborers took both above and below the ground. It also had to recognize that here too, miners' identity played a key role, as did their specific material environments, understood in the era's prevalent medical paradigm that is, Galenism or humoralism. The edict accordingly lists three clusters or spheres of health risks whose admixtures were typical for the period's mining industry. First, death and injuries caused by extraction itself and the assault of miasmatic fumes with which miners came into regular and close contact, especially under the ground. It does not mention another underground danger, namely demons, which we'll get to later. Next, straddling the sub and extranean worlds were risks stemming from supply bottlenecks of light, fresh air, people, tools, and timber moving into the mines, and distribution limits placed on water, foul air, ores, and processed metals moving out of them. Although the edict does not specify it, pollutants, or in the era's terms, miasmata, released from within the mines and by processing ores were likewise seen to impact smelters and others working and living near furnaces. Squarely above ground, miners' health could become compromised through inadequate nutrition and their safety through violence amongst themselves, but more commonly at the hands of locals. The latter risk could increase by miners' real or perceived difference as expressed in socioeconomic, ethnic, or religious terms. Finally, climactic conditions and certain stellar constellations could be detrimental to miners' lives as they impacted all lives, as postulated by Galenism. I contend, therefore, that the era's miners and their employers recognized sphere and site-specific hazards and developed a variety of prophylactic methods to resist them. Moreover, in doing so, they drew variously on the era's common sense, religious practices, and especially the medical paradigm of Galenism. Galenism defined health as a state of dynamic balance between the four bodily humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Humors had to be balanced amongst themselves, as well as with respect to external factors such as climate, the built environment, and social mores, and individual human behaviors such as diet, sleep, and exercise. This continuous balancing act reduced but hardly avoided disease. In fact, individual and group health relied on diverse factors, both human and non, and miners' preventative health programs regularly addressed such complexity. In demonstrating the latter, I will deviate a little from my derivative title and follow a rough schema of dig, eat, pray. So let's begin by observing how miners coped with hazards below the ground, following the four elements of air, water, fire, and earth. Learned authorities from Albertus Magnus in the 13th century to Georgius Agricola and Paracelsus in the 16th theorized about miners' health risks, above all, their exposure to harmful vapors emanating from metalliferous seams. Well before the introduction of the iconic canary into the British mines in 1911, you'll be surprised to hear, insufficient and polluted air was foremost on miners' minds. For instance, in his mining ordinances of 1208, Frederick, Bishop of Trent, decreed that miners encountering wind, ventum, while digging for silver, should neither conceal it nor hasten its release, but rather must allow it to escape slowly, quiete et pacifice, relying on the ventilation in place. Harmful air could also be lurking for advancing miners, causing pollution or triggering an explosion, for instance, when a pickaxe hit a seam. Recognizing this, miners created the ungrateful role, known in some quarters as the penitent, a colleague positioned at the vanguard and bearing an extended candle to induce preemptive or combustion of trapped gas. I hope they took turns there. But perhaps the most significant and costly intervention with respect to air was the sinking of vertical ventilation shafts into horizontal galleries, as you can see on the slide. The passive ventilation infrastructure could also serve as an emergency access route, helped illuminate galleries, and offered an efficient ways to communicate, hoist oars, and raise water to the surface. Shafts were routinely covered, sometimes with actual accommodation, to reduce the risk of inundation and falling objects, and could be split vertically into 2 or more zones to ensure the independence of people's mobility. Despite their advantages, however, passive ventilation shafts limited the depths of galleries in which miners could adequately breathe, a challenge later met by the development of air pumps. And speaking of pumps, their introduction was essential for adapting ventilation shafts into water draining infrastructure. For even within a relatively shallow depths, the danger of inundation was clear and present, owing much to the fact that mining sites were commonly located in mountainous areas. Here, precipitation flowing downhill and funneled into a narrow trench, let alone an undrained vertical shaft, could quickly become dangerous or lethal. The Zellschach mines in central Austria, for example, were rendered useless by a flood around 1186, and activities in the silver mine of Ozals in the Languedoc all but stopped due to an inundation in 1269. To limit such water-related risks, miners dug tunnels where possible with a slight incline from the entrance, allowing water and other unfixed matter to run counter to the direction of their advance. Tunnels also featured gutters, as you can see on the slide, in order to keep ground surface dry. Working within a vulnerable system, therefore, miners' safety was also defined by their position relative to the lowest drain, where the location of seams or other factors resisted positive inclines or prevented water from being evacuated outside the gallery. Miners could use the ancient technique of water screws, which Tina is using in her office, as we recently learned, although it has limited impact during wet seasons or flash floods. Its shortcomings eventually stimulated the development of human, animal, and water-driven pumps, with the first water wheel dedicated to draining a mine shaft attested in 1277 Rammelsberg in the Harz region, which I hope to see very soon. Oops. When air flowed smoothly through the mine and water levels remained low, it was the earth itself that threatened miners, starting with the rock's resistance. Trent's 1208 ordinances warned miners against exerting themselves by breaking overly hard surfaces, yet they forbade the most tried and cost-effective way of softening them, namely fire setting, under pain of 50 lire. From a health perspective, the prohibition made much sense. Fire setting could cause a tunnel unexpectedly to collapse. It also depleted the supply of oxygen, leading to asphyxiation, and ran the risk of spreading fire. But eschewing the cheap and effective practice was pointless, and it is hard to imagine it being fully observed. Moreover, fire setting came with its own preventative practices. For instance, miners could set up slow-burning fires to impact the rock around a seam before Sunday or a feast day, or else while exploring a different part of the mine without compromising their safety. So to put my Latourian card on the table, metalliferous rock was the source of miners' livelihood, status, and identity, but some of its qualities were also the bane of their existence. No miner could ever fully control the movement of earth and rock, and any sudden or unwanted encounter with it posed a real threat, from falling rock to hitting one's head or limb against it, to sitting or squatting on it for hours on end. Miners' first line of defense was illumination, using sticks, candles, or simple oil and lard-based lamps that could be repositioned as workers made their way along the seams. And these happen to be from Italy, If you come to this museum, you will see a greater variety of lamps as well. Traversal beams, timber frames, brick arches, and reinforced gates likewise increased people's safety underground, and as such are thoroughly discussed in the period's mining guides. Pictorial evidence, let's see if this loads, here we go. Pictorial evidence, moreover, suggests that miners wore protective gear, including mouth covers, wooden goggles, boots or leggings, canvas pants, leather aprons to protect their chests and backs, wide-rimmed hats, and hard leather gloves. Cushions and paddings attached to their pants provided not much needed relief for miners' knees and behinds. In addition to using local protection, miners developed contraptions to keep themselves safe during emergencies. The 13th century mining ordinances of Massa Marittima in Western Tuscany, for example, prescribed a safety protocol for entering the mine. Each person was to put a buckled strap and attach themselves to a rope running along the tunnel wall. If they became disoriented and when darkness struck, rocks fell, or a sudden rush of water altered their spatial perception, they could rely on the rope to return to safety. Conversely, if someone became stranded in the depths of the mine, the gear would enable others to reach and recover them safely, even without being able to hear or see them. In his mining guide, the 16th century metallurgist Vannoccio Biringuccio recommends simply leading a rope, 1 finger in thickness, along the route of an excavation. Beyond the appearance of legal and administrative sources, mining manuals, and as artifacts in local museums, preventative health interventions are still etched today on mines in the form of drains, lighting nooks, rope holds, and ventilation shafts. Human and other physical remains offer further evidence not only to the existence of prophylactic programs, but also to their implementation and impact. Linking such remains directly to mining communities, however, is only possible when monocultural sites preserve cemeteries that can be excavated, which is pretty tricky demand. The unique correlation is currently limited to 4 places, and I may be corrected that it's 5, and I'm happy to learn about more, namely Zalberget in Sweden, Kutnaora in Bohemia, Bronze in France, and Rocca San Silvestro in Tuscany. Collectively, the data they supplied conjures up an image of communities that were mostly egalitarian, well-fed, resourceful, pious, and peaceful. The partial exception to this rule concerns Zalberget, in which some war prisoners and criminals were put to work, and where skeletal and other remains confirm the impression of major social discrepancies, already given by a range of written sources. Even in Sweden, however, when we limit ourselves to what skeletons tell us specifically about subterranean realities, there is near total absence of major trauma. Oh, I forgot to show you the coolest slide. Okay. This is what we were talking before about the GIS project that I'm working on. But these are just the 4 sites out of many, many possibilities. So to date, the mining village of Brande in the French Alps has provided the bulk of this data, generated by a series of excavations dating back more than a century. For instance, a sample of 27 sufficiently articulated skeletons exhibit clear signs of ethnosopathy, a disorder of the tissues connecting bones and ligaments due to their overuse, which appears in hands, arms, shoulders, vertebrae, and legs of both men and women, or male and female skeletons. The same sample also exhibits many small fractures in the metacarpal bones, femurs, tibias, and metatarsal bones, attributable to minor incidents such as falling rock, tools, or timber. The absence of major trauma, however, major fractures, suggests the routine use of protective gear, lighting, and cautious behavior. Tellingly, none of these fractures appear in craniums, all but proving the use of head protection, despite such items never turning up in excavations. In addition, skeletons from Brands and Kutnawa show moderate to high levels of retroversion in the tibial plateau, likely indicating extensive squatting, and tibial periostitis, suggesting excessive physical activity. So nothing particularly surprising here, but good to have a confirmation from a different perspective. Archaeobotanical evidence allows us to move from digging to eating. The reconstruction of diets is of obvious significance from a present-day nutritional perspective, but eating well was also a fundament of Galenic medicine, and the era's health guides, albeit never composed specifically for miners, contain detailed instructions on the matter. At any rate, new techniques allow us to evaluate how rich and balanced diets may have been. At Brands, faunal remains, fruit pits, and other relics make it abundantly clear that residents raised animals and consumed their meat, especially goats, but also bovines and pigs, and relied to a lesser degree on game and fish. They also ate cereals in the form of bread and legumes, some of which they probably cultivated in walled gardens enriched by locally sourced manure. Miners' diets included nuts too, especially walnut and hazelnut, and fruits such as cherry, peach, and prune. Although they probably purchased some of the latter from lower-lying villages, fruit and nut trees can grow at up to 1,700 meters. That is about 100 meters below the village's altitude, and miners may have managed patches of orchards or forests nearby. If archaeobotany offers us a glimpse of what was available to miners, examining their jaws and dental remains brings us closer to their real diets. Hundreds of teeth and tooth sockets belonging to dozens of different individuals record rates of wear and tear of the enamel, the exposure of dentin, tooth decay, and jaw abscesses. With the exception of enamel erosion, which is directly linked to the chewing of hard food, these phenomena may reflect more than the influence of dietary practices, since they are impacted by a variety of health conditions. At any rate, teeth with advanced decay only slightly outnumber those with minor decay, a highly similar profile to that emerging from the cemetery of Saint-Laurent in Grenoble, the region's largest towns. And these are comparanda that historians like me need to learn how to work with, because without them, of course, the data is not really worth much. So thankfully, we have local comparanda. This suggests that the bread consumed at Brands was as fine-grained as in Grenoble, whether it was purchased abroad or milled locally. The picture emerging from Sauberget is by comparison of a far more stratified and differentiated diet corresponding to sex, age, and especially status. As I mentioned, the site employed unfree labor too, likely a small group of war captives from Russia, Denmark, or Poland, whose physical treatment could be rather harsh. Osteometric and chemical analyses of human and faunal teeth, in combination with archival sources and the physical burial context, support the hypothesis of a tripartite division into a large community of local families or people hailing from the Swedish mainland, a significant group of low-status immigrants, free and captive men, and a small group of foreign professional men, possibly water engineers from Germany, Austria, or the Netherlands. Not surprisingly, their nutrition varied, a fact confirmed by juxtaposing skeletal remains and financial records. And I won't bore you, I can go back to the data later to convince you about it, its accuracy. So we've dug, we've eaten, let us finally pray. Numerous sources and my own fieldwork confirm that mine shafts were typically signed with the cross. This serves as a reminder that no list of safety measures in Christian Europe would be complete without mentioning miners' piety, a preventative spiritual diet shared by millions. Biringucci's manual, which I mentioned, stressed that no mining campaign should begin before the mountain, workers' cabins, and the mine itself are blessed and baptized by a priest and dedicated to the Holy Trinity or Saint Mary. At the community level, this quintessential form of pre-industrial prophylactic was mostly practiced above the ground, but a tale from Cantal in the French Massif Central hints at how miners may have performed their piety underground. It recounts how 3 miners, described as good Christians, used to start their workdays with prayers until one day they forgot and were caved in by an avalanche. As soon as they resumed their prayers, however, a spirit visited them and, touching their lamp and morsel of bread, provided them with oil and food for 7 years, until their miraculous release from a quasi-purgatory. They had to suffer, but they got out eventually. Alongside safety gear and prayers, miners entering a tunnel, somewhat like soldiers going into battle, may have armed themselves with other objects meant to protect them, such as amulets. So far, I've found no such items or charms that directly address mining hazards, but one preventative practice was formalized in 1613 Sweden, namely playing dice at the mining cottage. Despite being frowned upon as Catholic or indeed magical by the recently installed Lutheran Church, the game continued to mark the pinnacle of New Year's celebration at the mine. It involved pairs of workers casting dice to determine the order in which they would commence their shifts in the year to come. Given the dangers of collapse, as well as the contingencies of hitting a rich seam, allowing divinely inflected game to determine who mined when would have been perhaps seen as inspiring some confidence. Finally, beyond the gray area of Orthodox devotions, a rich lore suggests that miners' health, safety, and productivity entailed pleasing or at least avoiding certain supernatural creatures. The trained physician, historian, and devout Catholic Georgius Agricola devoted a treatise to surveying underground creatures, De Animantibus Subterraneis, published in 1549. The essay concludes with several pages discussing friendly and inimical demons that dwell in mines. The discussion was hardly theoretical. Agricola, residing in Chemnitz, mentions that the latter type killed more than a dozen workers in nearby Annaberg and another miner in Schneeberg. He averred that the other demons, sometimes referred to as kobalos or hobgoblins in English, are all quite small and usually appear as old miners. They mostly wander along the tunnels, pretending to excavate and carry out tasks and play harmless tricks on miners unless they are provoked, in which case they can become quite dangerous. Miners, accordingly, had to avoid laughing, whistling, and hurling insults at these devils and learned how to stay in their favor in order to return home safely. Agricola's essay was later appended to his magnum opus, which we all know, De Re Metallica, but even beforehand, his observation on the entanglement of demons and miners were endorsed and circulated by Olaus Magnus, the exiled Archbishop of Uppsala, and as you can see in this woodcut, which accompanies his multi-volume description of Scandinavia, demons were simply something local miners had to factor in. To conclude, miners designed site-specific measures to promote their health and fight disease, equipped with a medical literacy and the heirs' piety and common sense. Below the ground, multiple preventative programs had measurable impacts on miners' well-being, from wearing gloves, boots, and hats to ventilation and emergency guiding systems. While above the ground, they practiced industrial zoning to reduce air and water pollution and adapted their surroundings to maintain sufficient diets. There is almost no evidence for violence among miners, suggesting that left to their own devices, such communities could thrive and settle their own disputes peacefully. Hundreds of these understudied communities dotted Europe, especially rural Europe, since the late 12th century, and examining their various records is a boon to all kinds of historical research. As I've stressed today, they provide us with a unique opportunity to improve our understanding of the air's preventative health measures. But they also illuminate rural industry, science and technology, and non-elite social organization in general. And they illustrate how communities adapted their surroundings in response to changing needs and circumstances. Finally, and beyond the scope of my paper, miners were quite aware of their industry's impact on their environments, including massive deforestation, erosion, and water and air pollution. They and their backers, investors, dealt with criticisms aimed directly at such environmental degradation, which perhaps spawned and certainly reflected new ways of understanding people's role within divine creation. Historians have long traced what came out of mines, but I hope we can begin to appreciate that miners' own history is a rich seam in itself that remains, at least from a European perspective, largely untapped. Thank you for your attention.